Professor Dean Allen. Dr. Dean Allen is basically a professional speaker, a great communicator, a master storyteller, a best-selling author, and most importantly of all, a historian. And that's what I do, so that's why we had to stick that at the end. He is going to speak tonight not about his intriguingly titled book, Empire, War, and Cricket, although if you're interested in that, it will be for sale and signed after the talk. But his most recent book just came out a couple months ago, The Man Who Changed the Landscape, the Adrian Gardiner story. It's a topic that's really much on our minds as an agency and as professional conservationists. It involves rewilding, in this case in South Africa, which has a slightly different environment than West Virginia. But it's an intriguing story. It's a positive story. I think it has some lessons for all of us going forward. So please give a very warm NCTC welcome to Dean Allen.
Thank you, Mark. Good evening, everyone. How are you? Thank you for coming out this evening. I really appreciate it. And good evening to everybody watching online as well, because I know we've got a very big audience. First of all, I'd like to introduce myself, as Mark said. Thank you for that wonderful introduction, Mark, and thank you for the kind invitation. To be at the National Conservation Training Centre is a real privilege. I mean, look at this facility that we've got as well. So I'm currently on a USA tour with my family, and we've spoken at various places around the country, and we're heading up north. But this is the one I was looking forward to, because this story tonight and this tale tonight, I think, will have real resonance with you guys. But you're probably wondering why this guy with this accent is going to be speaking about South Africa, right? Yes, I'm from England originally. I'm from the West Country. If you know anything about England, I'm from the edge of the Exmoor National Park, an area of wonderful countryside and wildlife, of course, but it's South Africa that has captured my heart, because I live here, ladies and gentlemen. I live in a place called Cape Town. Have you been? Anyone? If you haven't, please come and visit us, because I've had the privilege of traveling around the world. I do speak on cruise ships, hence the picture there. And it really is one of the most magnificent places in the world, because South Africa captured my heart back in the 90s. It was actually a lady that captured my heart. She was a South African, an Afrikaner. I met her at the gym, and she changed my life, because she said to me, Dean, stop moaning about your life and your job. I was in my mid-20s, going nowhere. And she was a dentist, and she traveled the world, and she was obviously a very clever lady. And she said, why don't you go to university? So I decided to give up my job and go to university. I was the first in my entire family to do so. I was a bit of a pioneer when it came to that. I was going to be a physical education teacher because I liked sport. Hence the title of my book. It was sport that really started me on the academic trail, as it were. And I ended up in South Africa, and I fell in love with the country, but not only the country, the people, and as I'll explain tonight, the wildlife as well, because that has taken me on a different path in the last few years, and I'll explain about that. So again, what a wonderful privilege to be here. But for those of you that don't know much about South Africa, I'm just going to give you a little introduction, but I'm going to leave it to somebody a little bit more famous, certainly richer than me, and I know you know him here in the United States, and here he is. This is South Africa for you.
Hi, I'm Trevor Noah, and I'm South African. And because I'm South African, people from all over the world insist on asking me questions about South Africa. So, I decided to make an ad to answer some of those fascinating questions. Like, how cold and snowy is your Christmas? Well, Tracy, unfortunately, we can't afford snow. Nah, I'm just playing. We're in the Southern Hemisphere, which means when it's freezing in Connecticut, it's fantastic in Cape Town. Klaus sent me this one. Can you play golf in South Africa? Well, Klaus, we actually have some of the finest golf courses in the world, but judging by your 37 handicap, can you play golf? How many stars are your 5-star hotels? Brian wants to know, can I meet the lions? Well, I don't know if you want to meet them, but you can see them on safari. And get this, it's not just lions, Brian. We've got everything. There's elephants, there's rhinos, there's giraffes, there's buffaloes, there's leopards. Come on, man, expand your horizons. Ostriches. Is South Africa fun? Is it fun? Are you even watching this commercial, Michelle? Paragliding, bungee jumping, surfing, river rafting, shark cage diving, hot air balloons, hiking, cycling, wine tasting, whatever this guy's doing. Does that not look like fun to you, Michelle? Does that not look like fun? So, now that I've shown you South Africa, my only question is, when are you coming to experience it for yourself?
Thank you, Mr. Trevor Noah, of course, one of our greatest ambassadors. But I think that was a really amusing video, of course. But South Africa is misunderstood, and it certainly was when I arrived in the mid-90s. We know the history of the country. But it just blew me away. Yes, it has its troubles, it has its crime, its corruption, but don't we all? And I think with that kind of video, it shows you that we do have a misunderstanding. And the one thing we do have there is unique wildlife. And we're going to talk about that today, of course, because South Africa, for me, gave me an opportunity. I arrived in the 90s, and I went on to do a PhD, and I went on to write a book that became a bestseller, and it probably is, I say, my #1 hit, and it was called Empire, War and Cricket. It's about a famous town in South Africa called Matjiesfontein. But for me, it was the story of the British Empire and how the culture of the British arrived in South Africa, and that funny game of cricket. Do anyone know cricket here in South Africa? In the United States, because in South Africa it's so significant, of course. And it was how the English taught the world to play and be civilized. That was the idea. That book, as I said, has sold over 50,000 copies in South Africa, which makes it a bestseller, and I still tell that story. But tonight I'm going to be talking about something else, because my life evolved as part of that. I went on to teach at universities all around the world. And in 2015, this book was released, but I went back to the UK to earn some decent money at Bournemouth University. And I spent 4 years there, and I was pretty miserable because I feel I'm South African now. I'd lost my English kind of connection, but something happened that was far more important. I met the love of my life, Danny, and she's here with us tonight. She's Slovakian. And we ended up moving back to South Africa a few years ago, and we got married in that place that I wrote about, and something else happened. You can see. I had what they call a lamaki, which is a late lamb, and that was Daniela, who was born. She's 4 now. You probably see her outside. Thankfully, she's got her earphones in, and she's busy at the moment, and that's my mum in the corner, because for me, South Africa has given me so much, and the background to that story is the fact that I can be here now, and I can talk about something that's so important to me, which is wildlife, which is nature. But we talk about my little one, and something happened that changed my life as well, because she was just born and this happened. And it's kind of connected with nature. Can you see a similarity with a creature that we know quite well along the coast here? What does that remind you of? Little turtle, of course. I grabbed my phone. I was going for a swim. I didn't expect that to happen. 20-second video. Put that on Facebook. 34 million views. 34 million views. My phone blew up. Little turtle is more famous than her dad. I've now got 200,000 followers because of that video. But joking aside, it's because of the connection with nature. It's the connection with something pure, of course. You can't get more beautiful than a baby on the beach for the first time, looking for the ocean. And by the way, she did make the ocean, and you'll have to see the video to follow up on that one. Because I'm going to now talk about wildlife, specifically something that's unique to Africa. Perhaps we have, down in South Africa, we have amazing beaches, as you can see. We have incredible scenery, we have amazing people, but the thing that we have that's unique is our wildlife. And these, ladies and gentlemen, are the so-called Big Five. The elephant, the lion, the buffalo, the rhinoceros, and the elusive leopard, of course. And they are a key marketing ploy now, or a tool in tourism, wildlife tourism. International tourists especially want to come to South Africa or Southern Africa and see the Big Five. But did you know that they were actually called the Big Five not because of tourism, because of hunting? those animals were deemed the most dangerous to hunt on foot, would you believe? And if you think about it, you wouldn't fancy it, would you? Now, I'm going to talk about the evolution of wildlife tourism today, but before we go any further, I just wanted to get us in the mood because, as I said, there's something special about Africa. There's something special about its wildlife. And tonight I'm going to be talking about rewilding because we have had an impact on this planet. We know that as people, but we are part of this incredible ecosystem that we call the planet. So yes, often we do look at ourselves in a negative way, but we can also do some magnificent things. So before I go any further, let's take us to Africa and just look at some of the wildlife.
In a wild corner of Africa, one of the worst droughts in decades is about to upend the lives of 5 different families. A mother cheetah faces a crossroads in the future of her kids. Her decision changes the course for a jackal couple who fights tooth and nail for survival in the shadows. A young leopard struggles to make it on her own, alongside the rowdy baboons, who could be food or a threat. Even the noble elephants must resort to emergency measures to survive. Everyone is on a collision course for the last remaining water. Some will make it, some will not. Their stories are all connected. But life's great events look different to everyone. And nature does not take sides.
That was filmed at a reserve called Mashatu, which is actually on the border of Botswana in South Africa in the north. I'll come back to the significance of that. But there's nothing more captivating than looking at wildlife and looking at those kind of short films, of course. But I'm going to take you now a little bit deeper because something special is happening down in South Africa. My South African journey really did change. Yes, I wrote the book Empire, War and Cricket, but I got a phone call about 3.5 years ago, and it went like this. Is that Dean Allen? I said, yes. He said, listen, I've been following your journey. I get your newsletter. I've bought some of your books, but I've had enough. I said, I beg your pardon, sir. He said, listen, you write too much about Cape Town. You give them far too much publicity. Do you know what we're doing here in the Eastern Cape? And I said, what's that? He said, you better come and visit because we are rewilding this particular region of South Africa. And I said, your name, sir? And he said, my name is Adrian Gardiner. Now that phone call was going to change my life because all of a sudden my shift went from history, culture, to wildlife, to rewilding, and the environment. And I realized that this was going to be my journey. So there we have a picture of little turtle in my arms just after arriving at Adrian Gardiner's reserve, which is Founders Lodge. And I realized that this was going to be a really significant change in my life. And I also had to learn a lot about what I was going to write about. Because in effect, I was going to write not only Adrian's story, but I was going to write about what was happening in that region. And it involved this word. It involved rewilding. Now, of course, at the National Conservation Training Centre, I'm sure a lot of you know as much, if not more, about this subject to me. But what I need to do is to put the context of what I'm going to be talking about tonight and what my understanding of rewilding is, because it's an important facet of what's happening in our environment today. We know it's the process of rebuilding a natural ecosystem by restoring those natural processes. I think we all agree in the room that nature does the best job of keeping us in balance. But if we disturb that balance, then things happen. So yes, as a result of major human disturbance, we need to look at a way of reversing some of these patterns. It makes ecosystems stronger and more resilient to things like climate change, natural disasters, combating those invasive species that perhaps we consider part of our environment now, and allowing those ecosystems to recover quicker. Things like climate change are always in the news, and regardless of what your opinion of climate change is, I think we've fallen into the trap of making this a political argument, and it shouldn't be. Because if climate change is something that affects us on a daily basis or a yearly basis, as it does in a place like the United States, surely we need to have a look at it and look at the patterns. Also, the fact that we have lost species already, perhaps forever, and a lot of species we know, but also degraded land. We are surrounded by land that perhaps is no longer of agricultural use, which I'll talk about, but also can be reversed in terms of bringing back its natural beauty, not only that, but its natural value to us as a human race and the environment around us. We know that rewilding is defined by the 3 C's. Core is that area of land that we put aside to be rewilded. Now, it could be of any area. I'm going to be talking about quite large areas in Africa, but it doesn't have to be a large area. That core of land is put aside for nature to restore itself. The corridor is what links those cores of land. Now, the important thing about a corridor, if we don't link these areas, they're just islands, and they're not connected. The corridor allows those almost islands to start relating to each other. It allows animals, particularly, and this is the easiest thing to understand, to migrate. Now, migration is such an important thing I've understood, because when we put a fence around any area of land, we are affecting animals' natural migration. And that means nature can't restore itself, because animals are in one area where it's overpopulated, overgrazed, and they can't move to another area. So it's important that these cores of rewilded land are linked by corridors. The 3rd C, which is always one to perhaps struggle with the understanding, is the carnivore. You'd think if we remove the apex predator from any system, the rest of the animals would flourish, wouldn't you? But no, you know the story, don't you? If we remove the apex predator from any system, the other animal species suffer as a result, which is quite incredible, but that's nature's balance. Perhaps we play the role of the apex predator, and that's something I'll be talking about. And it's not just on land, it's in our oceans. Down in South Africa, for example, we've seen that the great white shark population has been affected recently. That may be through rising water temperature. It may be through, we've had killer whales coming through for the first time in history, moving those populations on. But the fact that our apex predator is being removed from the oceans has affected populations elsewhere as well. It's a vision of stable, self-regulating and self-sustaining ecosystem with a near pre-human level of species diversity, because we want to get that balance back. Remember, we've lost some of our species already, but all is not lost. I'm going to give you some examples. Do you know what that beautiful animal is? The wild dog. Thank you. The wild dog. The wild dog is probably one of our most efficient hunting species on the planet because of their intelligence. They hunt in a pack. You know, you've got domestic dogs. I mean, how clever are your own dogs? Can you imagine these animals working together as a hunting pack? And that's what they do. But they need a wide, large area of land to be effective, of course, but also not to decimate the population that they're feeding upon. To give you an example of this animal being returned to an area of Mozambique called the Gorongosa State National Park, it was decimated. They brought the wild dog back in, and the population of the antelope and all the species that this animal feeds upon has actually flourished as a result. Seems strange, doesn't it? Are you convinced? Well, not just the carnivore. We can do the same with herbivores. And I'm going to come closer to home. You know the story of this animal, don't you? Because it's not just in South Africa where man arrived and wiped out indigenous species. The wonderful bison, of course, has been returned to the plains of Montana. You know the story. The grasslands, the insects, the other animals have flourished as a result because nature has been put back into balance. If you remove something like the bison, everything gets affected. Now, I have had the pleasure of being here for the past 24 hours, and I've walked around this wonderful campus, and I've looked on the walls, and I've been inspired by the environmentalists and those people that understand what I would be talking about tonight. And I look at some of the images, and here we have, in 1995, a biologist, as we can see, with a wolf returning to an area of the United States that we've all heard of called Yellowstone. And that process has been in the news, of course, because like some of our species in Africa, the wolf is a flagship species. We tend to think of the apex predator and the rewilding. They capture the headlines, but it's not just about these. It's about all the different species that affect each other. And not just in the United States this is happening. I had the pleasure this summer of travelling to the Highlands of Scotland. They've got a problem with an overpopulation of red deer. Now, in history, of course, the carnivores fed upon the red deer and kept everything into balance. Now there's no effective predator. The gentleman who wants to rewild parts of the Highland wants to bring back the wolf, which was indigenous to Highlands of Scotland. Now we can't have wolves, of course, roaming around the streets of Glasgow and Edinburgh, can we? But perhaps there is something in that. So what I'm saying is it's not just here in the wide open areas of the United States, even places as overpopulated as the United Kingdom. Rewilding is taking place. However, I wouldn't be an effective writer, author, historian if I didn't look at both sides of the story, because perhaps I'm preaching to the converted in this room tonight, but I've also given this same talk to farmers, to economists, to businessmen as well, because there's this argument, planet versus profit. We've heard it many times, but tonight I'm going to convince those perhaps in the room who are still a little bit cynical, question this motive, that there is a profitable reason why we have to rewild, because many people oppose rewilding because of its potential to hurt the enterprises, such as fishing, such as livestock, of course, farming, crop farming, even hunting. They say that, well, if you remove those ways of making a living, then how are we going to protect our environment? Well, if you think about it, we need to incentivize people, and that's an important part of my talk, and I realized that writing this book. Because let me make a statement to you, and I'll repeat it again and again. Conservation without cash is a conversation. We have to incentivize people, because if we don't, things don't happen. And what I realized when I was interviewing people on both sides of the scale, the businessmen, the people that opened up game reserves, perhaps for profit, they had a purpose, as well as the environmentalists. Perhaps some of the academics that wrote about the ecology of an environment. Is a case of working together. But again, you have to not only incentivize those people, but you incentivize the people on the ground. In our case, the communities in South Africa, the people that live in the township alongside the reserves, who now have employment. What about the farm workers who are now displaced? That's another story that I've had to deal with it. So I understand there is an argument of planet versus profit. But I'm going to go now to the wider scheme of things, because the United Nations, who have got the vast majority of nations to sign up to this program, would say that half of the world's gross domestic product is dependent on nature. And the degradation of ecosystems is already affecting about 40% of the world's population. But things such as health, livelihoods, and food security, 40% of the world's population is already being affected by this process. So it's something we can't ignore. If you still don't understand this, the United Nations 2030 Biodiversity Plan actually speaks to people who are thinking about the economics of conservation as well. You may have heard of this, but by 2030, the plan was, and I say was because we're nearly at 2026, so we're already behind the curve, undoubtedly. But the plan was, by 2030, global governments, not just South Africa, just not the United States, but governments around the world must take action towards the restoration of their own ecosystems. And look at this, restore at least 1 billion hectares. I think you speak in acres here in the United States, so 2.47 billion acres of land by 2030, and make a similar pledge for the oceans. That is a big plan, isn't it? That is a big plan. Dare I say we are behind the curve with this, but the fact that the plan is in place and we're working towards it is an achievement in itself. But how about this? For every US dollar spent on nature restoration, humans will reap up to $30 in economic benefits, such as improved pollination, cleaner air and water, and less extreme weather events. How many of you have been affected by an extreme weather event? Quite a few. As I said, I speak on cruise ships. My audience is predominantly North American. The hands go up. This is something we can't deny. So if I could give you an idea of how we could perhaps prevent that from happening, it's got to make economic sense, hasn't it? But what these governments have signed up to do is to ensure that at least 30% of terrestrial land, not only land, but inland water and coastal biodiversity areas, are effectively conserved and managed. 30% of the area needs to be effectively conserved and managed. And again, we're not talking about Yellowstone, we're not talking about the Kruger Park in South Africa, we're talking about those pockets of land we see all around us that can be restored and effectively managed. I look at the campus here on this wonderful facility. Even here, the difference is being made. Those are the kind of projects that need to be encouraged. Because, as you know, Europe is an overcrowded region. The United Kingdom's got nearly 70 million people. It's all very well saying, let's do this in places like Africa, South Africa, where we've got great expanses of land. But what about those overpopulated nations? They've got to work within their own constraints, but we still need them to make a difference. But I'm going to go back to Africa because this is where I'm based and this is where I see the hope for this project. And in fact, the world is looking at Africa because it has these biodiversity hotspots. We need to encourage people not to look at everywhere to be restored, but look at those areas which have already got this wonderful biodiversity value. And as we can see with Africa, the places around the coast predominantly, even up in the Mediterranean basin, the wonderful West African coastline there, the Guinean forests, the Horn of Africa is abundant in biodiversity, but here is where I'm concentrated in. South Africa's coastline and its interior has been identified as a place with great natural value. It won't surprise you that Madagascar is also on the list. These are areas that we can focus upon. So it's almost like achieving this through the low-hanging fruit. Let's go for those areas where there is that abundance of biodiversity. United States. Well, the thing is with the United States, we've got to incentivize people. Probably, arguably, the most capitalist society in the world. You're run on business, you're run on the value of that dollar. We've got to incentivize businesses to get involved. We cannot allow just NGOs, government authorities to run this. We've got to incentivize the private sector. In South Africa, it's the private sector that has run this program that I'm going to be talking about tonight. Because if we can prove to businesses that this is something they can't ignore, then surely that is going to be the benefit for all. Humanity, shareholders, and the owners of those businesses will benefit. So again, incentivize people. But like everywhere, there are issues here in the United States. And I could have changed that title to anywhere. Rewilding the Mediterranean, Rewilding Europe, because these issues are faced elsewhere. First of all, land use conflict. We know that our population in certain areas is growing. We are in conflict with nature for the land, for the resources. That is always going to be a case. So certainly somewhere like a developed nation like the United States. And this is where this idea of cores and corridors comes in. It's all very well talking about habitats, but if they're fragmented, nature can't operate if they operate in isolation. So while you have some wonderful areas and states, dare I say, government authorities that are doing great work, if you don't all join together, this is going to be a fragmented project. Certainly when it comes to the movement and genetics of wildlife, because that's something I'm going to be talking about soon. Climate change, changes in temperature and precipitation can alter ecosystems. As I said, we tend to fall into the trap, unfortunately, of again, this divide and rule, making it a political thing. If climate change is a fact, we need to do something about it. If it isn't, we're still suffering as a result. So let's try and lessen the impact of it. Invasive species. Now, I grew up in the West Country of England thinking this was the natural countryside. You know those hedgerows and the fields, the cows and the sheep? Well, that's nature. I live in the what? Now I realise absolutely not. There's very few true wild areas, certainly in a place like England or the United Kingdom. I live on the edge of Exmoor National Park, moorland, wild. It looked more like that, of course, before man arrived. But this idea of non-native species has to be combated, and we can do that through rewilding programs. Cultural resistance. Local communities, be it farmers, hunters, fishermen, they may go back and push back against, basically resist the rewilding efforts that they've put in place because they feel threatened. And that's, again, you've got to incentivize people. And we've seen that in Africa. If you don't incentivize people, local community, the business leaders, the farmers, this won't work. And you're talking just pie in the sky. We're wasting our breath. Government, politics. The lack of cooperation between states, perhaps in the United States, this wonderful country that you live in, is a series of states, and political parties. This has to be non-partisan. This has to be a human project. And unfortunately, this is getting pulled into politics, not just here, everywhere around the world. So yes, the United States has its issues, but I've seen great advances as well. Let's go back to Africa then, because that's where I'm focused, and I'm certainly focused in the south of Africa. And you can see, have you heard of the term biodiversity credit? Well, we're starting to pay landowners now to rewild their land. Leave the land alone. Let nature basically restore the land. But you need to replace their income. So remove the cattle, remove the sheep, remove the areas that are, can we say, that won't harm food security, because that's an important thing. We need to be very much secure in the fact that our future's got to be part of this as well. But those areas, like tonight, are areas of marginal food production. Those are the areas you can see on the screen that we can focus upon. So this idea of incentivizing farmers and landowners is very important. So now I'm going to take you on a journey. I'm going to take you to a place called the Eastern Cape. The Eastern Cape is probably not that well known to a lot of you. Its capital is a place called Port Elizabeth there, and that's where I lived for the last 3 years while I was writing this book. It's about an 8-hour drive to the east of Cape Town. So Cape Town's along here somewhere, and Durban's up that way. But the Eastern Cape, an incredible place. Like Adrian Gardiner said, you better come here and tell its story, and that's what I'm going to do tonight, because I'm going to give you an example. I'm all about giving examples, concrete examples of where this is working, and it's working now in a part of South Africa you may not have heard of. I know we have a South African in the room, so it's nice to feel at home, but she'll certainly know the area that I'm talking about, because in many respects this was the soul of the country. This is where a lot of the wars were fought. This is where our struggle leaders were born. The Eastern Cape has something about it, but it's also leading the way in terms of rewilding in southern Africa. Because everything was fine, ladies and gentlemen, before we arrived, before people arrived, certainly in terms of the settlers. And this is where I'm so passionate about the United States, because there's so many comparisons. You know, that push west and, that manifest destiny, this idea of improving things. Well, we were always going to change things, perhaps irrevocably, perhaps forever. But there's a purpose behind studying history, as Mark will attest to. So in 1820, the British, the English, sent down settlers to the Eastern Cape of South Africa to provide a buffer, almost, between the African tribes that were moving towards Cape Town and the Europeans who were moving eastwards away from Cape Town, because this land was absolutely fertile, it was attractive. They wanted to gain control. So the 1820 English settlers arrived, many desperate people. They traveled on months. Can you imagine being that desperate to get on a ship? From England, post-Napoleonic War Britain. England was in a recession, so you were desperate enough to put your family on a ship and go to a place you've never even heard of. You were promised, no doubt, unbounded riches, but when they arrived, they realized that they didn't have much there. They had to survive. So this happened in 1820. They were frontiersmen, just like your celebrated people of the Wild West here in the United States. You understand the dynamic. Let's not judge them perhaps on what they did next with regards to the wildlife, because we would have done the same. They had to survive. They had to make a living off the land. So you cannot survive with elephants, lions, leopards, rhinoceros all around you. They're a threat, of course. You have to almost become the apex predator, and that's what these people did. They changed the landscape from an area that was abundant in wildlife in the early 1800s to an area that looked like this by the mid to late 1800s. They changed the landscape. This became a landscape they recognized. It almost looks like the West Country of England. They introduced cattle, sheep, goats. Do you know how destructive goats are? And as I said, they had to survive on this land. But the one thing they couldn't compete with was the wildlife, because the Eastern Cape, you may not know this, had greater number of species than any other area of southern Africa before the arrival of the settlers. And it wasn't just the settlers, by the way. The African tribes moving through, the Xhosa, the Zulu were in Durban, but the Xhosa were especially in large numbers around this area. There were people here originally, But they were the Bushmen, the Khoi, the San, who migrated naturally with the animals, just as the animals did. So they worked with nature, but these people were different. We planted, we built homes, we changed the landscape. And what did we do to start off with? We hunted, of course. I mean, hunting's part of our culture, isn't it, in South Africa and the United States? We hunted for the pot, no problem. But they kept hunting. They started to eradicate the more exotic species that were of no good. So they hunted everything out. Species like the giraffe, of course. Not only that, they brought in professional hunters. They brought in people like Jim Sutherland on the left. He was a professional elephant hunter. He came down to the Eastern Cape to an area called Addo. The Addo National Elephant Park is famous today, but what have I told you? Back in the day, there were nearly 1,000 elephants in this region, competing with the people who had just settled. So the professionals came in. Do you know they hunted those animals down to the last 11? And the only reason 11 of the original elephant group existed because a matriarch, one of those intelligent old mother elephants, took the family down into the deep, darkest thicket of one of the valleys. Because this was the Albany thicket. It's a biome that looks nothing like you have seen in Africa, and I'll show you a video in a minute. This isn't those open, parched savannas. This is green. This is lush. Rivers are running through it. The animals that live here enjoy the thicket and the grasslands. The black rhino, that magnificent species, this is its home. This is where it came from. But man arrived and couldn't compete, or wasn't prepared to compete with the elephant, of course. We know elephants can be extremely destructive. There was the ivory trade as well. So Jim Sutherland, an ex-military man, came in, and you know, he proudly states that he eradicated, shall we say, over 1,600 elephants in his illustrious post-military career. But again, are we to judge them on today's standards? Back in the day, these men were celebrated. And by the way, it wasn't just the British that did it, ladies and gentlemen. I'm in the United States, so I'm going to pin the finger on you as well. This was Paul Rainey. He was a New York philanthropist, entrepreneur or businessman. And his great joy was to come down to Africa, and as you can see, morning's work killed him 15 minutes, eradicating a pride of lion. But they didn't understand, if we can defend the actions, they didn't understand that the animals would not just keep coming. They didn't understand that this was not, this untapped source would stop at one point. And that's exactly what happened. They kept shooting and shooting until there were no animals left. And by the way, ladies, it wasn't just the men. This is Lady Cuthbert, a Welsh aristocrat, and her thing was to come down to Africa and shoot those magnificent Cape Buffalo bulls, as you can see there. Now I'm going to talk about a topic. I talked with Mark earlier about it, and I think we need to address it. Hunting. Hunting is part of this story. Hunting is part of conservation that I didn't realize. I'm not a hunter. I wouldn't pay anything to shoot an animal, but people do. And I realized that the hunting economy in Africa is so important. I probably interviewed about 50 ecologists, environmentalists over the course of this book. And without fail, every single one of them agreed or pointed out that if we've removed commercial hunting, ethical hunting from southern Africa today, our conservation efforts would collapse. So that's something we need to listen to. We need to listen to the people working on the ground. But I'm talking about ethical hunting. I'm talking about, I suppose, why hunters do it, to be part of nature, to want a natural environment. I'm not talking about this kind of hunting, because this is what makes the media. This is what gives any kind of commercial hunting a bad name. This is what they call trophy hunting, or in this particular case, canned hunting. And it's what's given South Africa a very bad name. Thankfully, it's been banned, it's been outlawed, but it still happens. If you don't know what it is, ladies and gentlemen, people pay a lot of money to travel down to Africa and basically shoot these magnificent animals in a glorified caged area. It's like shooting fish in a barrel. I'm not a hunter, but there's no sport in that, is there? But unfortunately, those people that want to outlaw hunting because they're doing it, no doubt from some moral standpoint, this is what they see. But there's different levels. If I told you that I know of a hunting reserve in South Africa that the World Wildlife Fund has actually supported them by putting black rhino into their reserves, that will shock you, madam, I can see that. But the World Wildlife Fund recognise that some of these reserves pride themselves in conservation far superior to the wildlife tourism reserves. Now, you're not allowed to shoot a black rhino. But if anybody wants to come down and spend $1 million on shooting a wonderful kudu bull, they want a natural environment. And these places are run with conservation in mind, but they're run because they're a business. And that's where I'm talking about the business of conservation. Now, it's difficult for me to talk like this, but that is the reality on the ground. And who am I to say? So if we eradicate hunting completely, our conservation efforts and our rewilding efforts in South Africa will collapse overnight. What we need to get rid of is this, the propaganda behind that kind of thing. I don't think anybody can disagree with me on that because, as I said, you've all seen that in the newspaper, and I don't think that needs to be looked at anymore. Let's go back to the Eastern Cape, though. The Eastern Cape, for me, is a place that needs to be celebrated. Economically, it struggles. It's not important, perhaps, politically in South Africa, but as I said, it's got incredible history, but what it has is a landscape that will allow rewilding. And I'm going to take you now to a place called Kariga, probably my favorite reserve. It's got generations of family history as a farm. But 40 years ago, the landscape was changed. This is what Kariga looks like now. Welcome to the Eastern Cape, ladies and gentlemen. Beautiful, isn't it? Different kind of Africa, different biome. It's called the Albany thicket biome. As you see, very dense. That's where the black rhino likes to go. But the thing is, man has changed the landscape. So 40 years ago, a lot of that would have been farmland. Kariga is an amazing project because, as I said, 40 years ago, this would have been overgrazed farmland. 4 generations of families, over 4 generations of the Rushmere family, of now, as farmers, have changed their purpose for their land. And that's exactly what's happening. So it's wildlife tourism that has changed the landscape here. Again, the benefit comes to people, but it also comes to the community. As you can see in that video, there's an aspect of community here, and that's the most important thing because you're actually benefiting the community as well as the landscape as well. So if we look now, this is the book that inspired this. Now, this is Adrian Gardiner. Now, when I got that phone call, I didn't know Adrian's story. Well, he stood high up on this hill, overlooking this overgrazed, decimated landscape of farmland in the late 80s, and he didn't know what his purpose was going to be, but he knew that it was good value. He bought a farm. He bought a second farm because farms were going cheap. There'd been a drought in the region. As I said, generations of overgrazing, some hunting land as well. But being the businessman that he was, he looked at the various opportunities here. He considered farming, he considered commercial hunting. But he read a book by Jack Skeed, and Jack Skeed was a historian who looked at the various species within this region. And he was the one that reported there were more indigenous species in the Eastern Cape than anywhere else in Southern Africa. And he was the man that inspired Adrian to actually change the landscape, because Adrian said, why can't we bring them back? Now, he's the kind of personality he doesn't take no for an answer, but he had a challenge. This was the late 80s. He'd already been involved in construction, even racehorse breeding. There's an entrepreneur, a businessman, somebody who wants to do something different, and perhaps this was going to be his legacy. And he created a thing called Shamwari Game Reserve. Shamwari today is one of the most prestigious game reserves in the world, perhaps. But he had to start from nothing, and that's why the title, The Man Who Changed the Landscape. He could see the commercial value in this. So he walked the streets of London. He got those British tourists to come down to turn their back on Zimbabwe and Kenya and those places. They'd always gone on safari. He had to sell South Africa, not just the Eastern Cape, but South Africa, because South Africa for 50 years had been in isolation because of apartheid. So he had to almost build a market. And I write about in the book some of the challenges, how the animals were reintroduced. They didn't have the regulations at the time. He didn't really know what he was doing, so he brought in experts. And he also brought in skills from his business aspects, such as the marketing skills. So some of the earliest people to arrive at Shamwari, which wasn't a great reserve to start off with, you may have heard of them: John Travolta, Brad Pitt. Tiger Woods even got engaged at Shamwari. It made the news. All of a sudden, there was a destination. People started to talk about it. But he also knew that he had to have the right people on side, because this was a challenge. He was a pioneer. He then had to go to the landowners who had been there for centuries to say to them, this is a way we can actually make a difference. You've probably heard of this man. He wrote the foreword in the book. This is Gary Player. Any golfers in the room? Well, Gary Player is quite a well-known man, but it's his brother I want to focus on. That's Ian Player. Ian Player was credited with saving the right rhino in the 60s and 70s, a really famous conservationist. Adrian and Ian Player struck up this association. Adrian had the business acumen and the drive to make this happen, but Ian Player could hold him back in terms of give him the advice. If you're going to change this landscape, let's do it in the right way. So he gave him the advice of bringing the correct animals back, shaping the landscape, allowing the land to recover. And that's the story that I've talked about. And Adrian today, as you can see, is a rather big man. He's 83 years of age, and this is going to be his legacy. And he's been at this for the last 40 years. So it was a privilege for me to tell his story. And what he did then, in 2008, he created this Shamwari Game Reserve. He'd inspired other people to create game reserves. Remember, in South Africa, there's a slight difference than other countries. It's driven by the private sector. Yes, the state has some say, but the private sector drives conservation. Because in other areas of Southern Africa, places like Kenya, Zimbabwe, Botswana, Namibia, the animals are owned by the state. But because of 1974 and the Adequate Enclosure Act, it made South Africa different. It meant that as a landowner, if you could prove that you could enclose your land in an adequate way, those animals, in effect, would be your property. And of course, that was mainly done through hunting purposes. But the reason is, now, and people have told me, if you put a value on an animal, it gets preserved. And that's where the business of conservation comes in. It comes back to the saying, conservation without cash is a conversation. And the value of animals in South Africa has rocketed because of the private sector. Thankfully, not just through hunting, but now increasingly through wildlife tourism. So we can shoot an animal in two ways. We can either shoot it with a rifle, but God forbid, I'd rather shoot it with an iPhone or a camera, wouldn't you? And that's where the value comes. So now all of a sudden people are visiting our country because of the private sector and these wonderful wildlife reserves that have grown up because of Adrian's example. We now have 17 private reserves in the Eastern Cape. 40 years ago, there were none. There was the Addo State Park, but that just had the odd elephant. Now it is home to the big five. So even the state-run park has benefited as a result. Now Adrian went on to create something called Mantis, which Ian Player named for him. Man and nature together is sustainable. He also created an NGO called the Community Conservation Fund of Africa. Again, it focused on the fact that community was the key. The fact you had to benefit people if this was going to work. And that's exactly what happened. Now, as you can see, he likes a picture. He's very good at marketing, but he also understands where the economy of conservation in Africa comes. The vast majority of funding that comes into African conservation funding, ladies and gentlemen, comes from here. North America. So Adrian partnered with American Humane recently. As you can see, he likes a picture with an attractive lady and he likes the odd award. But that's the nature of the gentleman that's driven this process. Sometimes you need that kind of personality. So what do you do at 80 years of age in Africa? Well, you can play golf, you can go on the odd cruise. But with Adrian, he decides to create another wildlife reserve. And this is different from Shamwari. It's not 11,000 hectares. It's not 20,000 hectares. It's a small pocket of land that is only 20 minutes away from Port Elizabeth, one of our major cities. And it is called Neosi. And let me show you it. Located in what we call Nelson Mandela Bay, which is the greater area around Port Elizabeth, or Quebec as it's called today. Its location is key. It means that people can go there and view animals in the wild for the first time. I'm talking about Africans as well. They've never seen an animal in the wild. You think that this would be a norm. It isn't. This is affordable. You can go to here, you can have a lunch, and you can go on a game drive for about $35, $30. That's affordable. It's not one of these places that's just geared up for international tourism. So for me, this is the project that I like to champion. It's a small area of land, 3,100 hectares. It's tiny, but it can support certain species. The ecologists will come in, they will formulate the plan for the area. You can't have lion here, you can't have, of course, wild dog, but you can have, as the apex predator, the cheetah, because of the area of land. It wouldn't decimate the antelope population, for example. It's under the guidance of Adrian's NGO, the Community Conservation Fund of Africa. Again, community is important. Right next to Neosi, there's a settlement of several 100,000 people. Now, if you do not incentivize them, if you do not have them involved in this project is not going to work. And that's exactly what has happened. But it's all about reintroducing native wildlife species, big and small, to try and reinstate a full complement of biodiversity, but also to establish direct community benefit. Again, people are a part of this ecosystem. Now, I just want to talk about cheetah before we finish up here, because cheetah, for me, one of the most amazing predators there are. Did you know that they are still very threatened? In 1900, there were over 100,000 cheetah in southern Africa. Now we're looking at about 7,000. Now, one of the things you should be thinking about now, what about the gene pool? That's the important thing here, because if we fence land, animals cannot migrate. It's not just to feed, but it's also to repopulate. So what we do in even these bigger reserves is animals are transferred between. They're bought and sold and transferred, and they're managed because the populations with there will be inbreeding, of course. And that's the key. What this plan is about doing is, it's all very well in having these 17 or 18 private reserves and the national reserve. What the plan is, ladies and gentlemen, is to drop the fences. Drop the fences between these reserves so animals can migrate. But do you see a problem? I do. People. Their own selfish. If I own a herd of elephant and you do, and we've got a fence between us, we're okay. People stay at your lodge and they stay at mine. What about if we drop the fence and all my elephants then suddenly go onto your reserve? Nobody comes to stay with me. Then people will say, well, that's okay. After 20 years, the elephants will move back because they would have. It doesn't work like that, does it? So that is still the answer that I haven't found when I asked that question. We need to incentivize people to drop the fences and to allow the animals to move freely. And the reason why the Eastern Cape is a focus of this, by the way, it's a relatively low populated area in terms of density of population. So this has got to be done with people involved as well. There are relatively few major roads, for example, or big urban areas, and that's why this is the focus. They're talking about creating a mega park, mega reserve from the coast right up into the interior that is as big as the Kruger National Park, an area the size of Wales, if you know what that is, in terms of that. The gene pool of the cheetah needs to be diversified, so therefore the idea at NEOC is to bring the cheetah in to rewild them. They're captive-born animals, and it's incredible how the instinct of an animal that is born in captivity is there. It's innate. But if you give it the opportunity, I promise you, within 2 or 3 weeks, a cheetah learns how to kill in the wild. Then you release that cheetah to a larger reserve and the gene pool gets diversified. Because of habitat loss and illegal wildlife trade, there's obviously an issue, but captive cheetahs rewilded are then rehomed at larger parks, and that's how the metapopulation is established and maintained. Now, I talk about people. I can give you an example. This lovely lady is Anele. She was born right next to where this reserve was created in the township there. She is now walked, can I say, hand in paw with this beautiful animal called Incanyisa, which was the first female that was introduced into NEOC. And that beautiful cheetah female has just had her first litter, just produced the next generation. And those animals will then be moved on to larger reserves. And that lady has been trained up as the first ranger, the first guide from her community. So what better way to incentivize a community? She's the ambassador that goes back and explains that this use of land is far more beneficial to her community than what was being used there before, because it wasn't. It was just overgrazed land that was not being used. So it's not just in South Africa. Another good example is a place called Mashatu, which is known as Land of the Giants, and it's here in this corner of Zimbabwe, Botswana, and north of South Africa, right in that little pocket. Again, this was very much an agricultural area 50 years or so ago. Overgrazed with a settler population there, but it's been turned into this great example of rewilding. One of the largest private elephant herds in southern Africa, but it's also a place where I could take you to show you the elusive leopard, because the one animal of the big five I have never seen in the Eastern Cape is the leopard. Do you know why? Because they're pretty elusive. They tend to be solitary and they operate at night. Has anybody seen a leopard in the wild? Our South African friend or one or two? Well, you're privileged. I had to go to Mashatu to see my first leopard because, as I said, that reminds you that this is a wild area. If you ever go to a reserve and they can guarantee you to see an animal in a certain place, you're not at a reserve, you're at a zoo. These are wild areas and animals are unpredictable. And that's what makes this such a wonderful experience, that every day can be different. You can go out and you feel that buzz that you're in wildlife. Now, the reason why I just want to focus on Mashatu is because, again, there's a business model. The gentleman that has regenerated this region is a man called Steve Lansdowne. He is a very, very wealthy financial man from England. He's fallen in love with Africa like I have. He's a proud Bristolian from the city where I'm from. He has a large bearing on my happiness because he owns my football team called Bristol City. But apart from that, he's a billionaire and he's fallen in love with Africa. And he understands the business model behind rewilding. And that's what we're going to do to end this talk. I'm going to take you back to Mashatu, because this is where this film was filmed. And we saw what it was like in drought. Well, the rains have arrived. Let's see how the animals react to that.
In a wild corner of Africa, life comes to terms with a new reality. Abundance. A mother leopard must teach her baby the tricks of survival in paradise. When they eat, the young jackal family has food too. But wealth like this attracts unwanted attention. Competition is on the rise. The baboons are challenged for their piece of Eden. Mothers must feed their kids and keep them safe, while the scavengers are at each other's heels. Their stories are all connected. But life's great events look different to everyone. And nature does not take sides.
That's Mashatu, as I said, in the borders of South Africa and Botswana. Absolutely beautiful. As the program says, nature does not take sides, but all our stories are connected. And I think that's the key. If we allow nature to restore some of the land, we're going to have a more positive future. So ladies and gentlemen, if you haven't already, please come and join us on an African safari. But make sure you understand the process behind it, because these projects that I've been talking about today, they have changed the landscape. It is all part of this rewilding process. And it's a great example of us to at least feel good about ourselves again, isn't it? Quite often we do run ourselves down, but we can make a difference. And we haven't got a choice. I've given you the economic argument as well. We haven't got a choice because we've only got the one planet. It's been a pleasure speaking to you tonight. You can see it's an emotional subject we talk about. It's our planet. History is. There's all different ways of looking at history. Living and working in South Africa, you have to be very diplomatic sometimes, and you have to talk to other people of different backgrounds. As I said, I've given this talk to a room full of farmers recently, and that was quite a difficult audience. But at the end, at least, they understood that the message came from the right place. So ladies and gentlemen, as I said, thank you. Some of my books are available. The Man Who Changed the Landscape came out in May. It is a great story of this journey that I've walked, and we've got a few copies of Empire War and Cricket as well. But I do this for a living, so please give me feedback. As I say, when it comes to our planet, when it comes to human history, there are different ways of expressing it, but I promise you that I've learnt as an Englishman living and working in South Africa since the 1990s. I've learned to listen, I've learned to absorb, and I hope that comes across in my books as well, because at the end of the day, the people that are doing this work, they're the people that I certainly respect, and I hope that I've given them credit. So thank you again for your time this evening. Thank you for coming out on this cold evening up here in West Virginia. It's been a privilege to speak to you, and thank you again.
Hi, I'm Mark Madison. I'm the historian for the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, coming to you from the National Conservation Training Center. And today we have a very special guest. We have Dr. Dean Allen, who is a lecturer, a best-selling author, and most importantly, a historian. And he is out here at NCTC promoting his brand new book, recently published, The Man Who Changed the Landscape, the Adrian Gardiner story. So thank you very much for coming out, Dr. Allen. We appreciate it.
No, what a pleasure, Mark. Thank you for having me. I think this is the highlight of my entire US tour. I'm really looking forward to this evening, which is our talk, of course, and to having this chat. Thank you.
And since you mentioned it, for those of you listening to the podcast, if you want to hear Dr. Allen's full talk, it'll be on YouTube on the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Station. It'll be up there in about a week, so please go there and hear the full talk. So the Adrian Gardiner story takes place in South Africa, and tell me first how you came to this story.
Well, as you know, I live in South Africa. I live in the beautiful city of Cape Town, and originally from England, in the West Country of England, on the edge of the Exmoor National Park, if anybody knows that region. Beautiful part of the UK, but in the 1990s I met a young lady actually. She was a South African, and she changed my life. I went to university in my mid-20s, and it took me to a place called Stellenbosch University down in South Africa in the mid-90s, and I fell in love with the country, I fell in love with the people, and I realised I didn't know much about its history. And I decided I was going to dedicate, well, probably my career to writing about South Africa's history, but more the colonial history, sort of the British Empire and that kind of thing. I was originally interested in sport, would you believe, and its impact around the world. You know, us Brits, we played cricket and rugby and all those kind of sports, and how they travelled around the world and what message they took with them. And I realised that this was the place for me. So we've talked previously about our careers. I've worked at universities in Northern Ireland, in Australia, in the United Kingdom, but South Africa is really my home now, and it's where I have my heart. So about 4 years ago, I was contemplating my next project, and I got a phone call out of the blue from a gentleman called Adrian Gardiner. I hadn't heard of him, I will admit, and I think that was an advantage because I came at it with a fresh pair of eyes, and he invited me to a part of South Africa called the Eastern Cape, which if anybody knows that part of the world, the city of Port Elizabeth, which is now called Quebec, we've changed the name. And Adrian created the first internationally renowned wildlife reserve in that region, called Shamwari Game Reserve, which I'd heard of course. And it was just over 40 years ago. He had this vision to repopulate the region with the original animals that once lived there. And I suppose he'd been following my journey, and as a great businessman that he is, he saw that not only was I quite good at writing books, but I was good at promoting books and telling stories.
Wise choice.
Of course, and that this was going to be a wonderful relationship. So that's where the book came from. So it's a book that was released now in May this year, May 25. And I'm proud to say that it's been received very, very well, not only in South Africa, but now increasingly around the world, because it's a story, I think, that will travel. It's not just about South Africa, it's about rewilding anywhere on the planet.
Well, you mentioned rewilding. Before it became a wildlife preserve, what did the area look like?
Well, we're historians, so of course I go back to how that area did look. And before I go any further, I should say that the Eastern Cape, which is the Albany thicket biome, it's a certain type of ecosystem. It's very kind of river valleys, not the Africa that people imagine, not the savanna, not the wide open spaces. This is thicket, bushes, some grassland, but very kind of green and dense. And it supported more species than any other region of southern Africa. And we know that by our historical records. A gentleman called Jack Skeed had read historical accounts from the settlers, from tribesmen, from Africans in that region, and they talk about the thousands and thousands of, for example, springbok that migrated through that region, and they document all the different species. So the reason why this is such a significant story is because after the 1820 settlers, the English, of course, were part of this story. They were encouraged, shall we say, to leave post-Napoleonic War Britain, get on ships, go down to Africa, and basically become human buffers between the African tribes and the English in Cape Town at that time. And it was very much a purposeful thing that happened. But these desperate people had to survive, so they formed farms. They did what they did at home, back in places like where I'm from, the West Country of England. But the animals, of course, were going to compete with them. You cannot raise cattle, sheep, goats, etc., and a family if there are elephants, if there are a lion, if there are leopards, if there are cheetah in the region, which we know existed. So they eventually got shot out, of course. We've seen that story here in the United States, and that's what makes it so remarkable. And what we can see, going into the 1970s, the 1980s, this land had been largely degraded. It was overgrazed. There was a large goat population in that region. You know how destructive goats can be.
Absolutely.
And a drought had also caused a lot of damage. So this was land that was largely of little use. Some farmers were still struggling in that area, and it has always been an area of marginal food production. That's a key point, because we know about the human-animal conflict. We're part of the ecosystem, so we need to provide our own food and security.
Yeah.
Whereas, as I said, in the late 1980s, this gentleman, Adrian Gardiner, came along and he saw a business opportunity. He bought up farms in that region because they were cheap. But then he realised he had to make money from this. So what was he going to do? He looked at farming, he looked at commercial hunting. But then he read these books by Jack Skeed, and it inspired him to do something they had done further north. I'm sure many of the listeners and viewers would have heard of the Kruger National Park.
Yep.
He said, why can't we have our own Kruger here down in the Eastern Cape? And that's what he did. He had the vision, and can we say the determination not to take no. And as I said, that's written about in the story. It's an incredible human story of endeavour, entrepreneurship and determination.
When you're trying to transform a landscape from agriculture to a wildlife preserve, what's the first thing you do? Do you plant trees or bushes?
That's a very good question. We look at that. I mean, the first chapter of my book, I look at what was there originally. I look at the history of the land. We go right back to the prehistoric times and the fossils that were found there. Then, of course, man came in, and the original, before we go any further, I should say the original inhabitants of that region, or southern Africa, weren't the Xhosa or the Zulu tribe that we tend to think of today, or the larger African tribes. They migrated from sub-Saharan Africa thousands of years ago. The original people there were the Bushmen, the Khoi, the San, who lived in harmony with the animals. So, of course, the dynamic of man coming in was going to change everything. So now you, as you rightly said, you have this degraded land. What will you do? Well, first of all, you need to bring in the experts, and that's what Adrian did. You bring in the ecologists, you bring in the environmentalists, you ask what will be needed to sustain these populations of animals. And also you have to be a little bit cautious. You cannot, it's not like Noah's Ark, you can't bring them all in at once.
Right.
And so there were mistakes made, and I think that's probably some of the most colourful stories in the book where these mistakes were made, because nobody had a template of how to reintroduce species. Adrian, being a businessman, and I'm quite clear about that, he would be a pioneer of wildlife tourism as opposed to a pure conservationist.
Right.
He understood the business aspect of this. So the first thing he had to do was create a market, and he had to create, can we say, income to generate this project that he was going to undertake. So yes, he introduced some of the more well-known species. He had help in terms of landscaping those areas. It wasn't all overgrazed, I should say, Mark.
Yeah.
There were prime areas of land that had been spared. There was still thicket. There were still the river valleys that these animals could thrive in. But the incredible thing is, Adrian is a wonderful marketer, and he brought the rich and famous down to that area. So people that you would have heard of, like John Travolta,
Really?
Brad Pitt, even Tiger Woods was invited to actually be engaged, would you believe, on Shamwari Game
Really?
Reserve, which Adrian leaked to the press inadvertently, not inadvertently, but he did so on purpose. It was all good publicity.
Yeah.
So he created a noise. And remember, this was South Africa in the early 1990s. We just emerged from apartheid. We'd been in isolation for 50 years because of our politics of racial divide. So Adrian not only had to sell a new area of South Africa, he had to sell the country, because international tourists were going to places like Zimbabwe, Kenya, particularly the British, who are our traditional visitors.
Yeah.
Now, thankfully, we've got the Americans coming down in their thousands. So Adrian could see that this was a project that was going to take a number of years. So to answer your question, it wasn't overnight.
Took a long time.
It did indeed.
How do you bring the animals back? Do you take them from other wildlife preserves,
Exactly.
or do they come back on their own?
And as I often explain, a preserve is something that is an artificial construct. If you have a fence around any area of land, whether it be 1,000 acres, whether it be 10,000 acres, it is still artificially managed, because those animals cannot migrate naturally. And I think we have learnt that the idea is, of course, to drop the fences between the different preserves, to create nature's way of restoring the land itself. That's what rewilding is about. You know, they talk about the 3 C's, don't they? Core, corridor and carnivore in terms of the basis of rewilding. So how do you physically bring them back? Well, in Adrian's case, you literally put animals on the back of a horse truck or on the back of a lorry, and you transported them, because in the early days, in the 90s, you didn't have the regulation that you have now. And as I said, there's a wonderful story in the book, and I don't want to give too much away, but his vet, a wonderful gentleman called Johan, brought brought a group of lion in on a small aircraft, and those lions started to wake up on the aircraft as they were mid-flight. Can you imagine anything more horrific?
No.
It's not snakes on the plane.
Right, it's a new
lions.
Samuel Jackson movie.
It's lions on the plane. So these kind of colourful stories make this, make this even more entertaining. And as I said, Adrian's personality definitely makes it entertaining. He's a very gregarious, charismatic man, but he wouldn't take no for an answer. So physically, you were bringing animals in, but remember, there were also animals within this region for another reason. There's the hunting industry that was never eradicated, and it's part of the economy of South Africa now. So people were always trading in animals at that time. The 1974 Adequate Enclosure Act in South Africa permitted people to privately own the wild animals on their land if they could prove that they had adequate enclosure. And that's what makes South Africa different from the other examples in Africa, is because there is a private trade in game. Whereas if you go to Kenya, Zimbabwe, Botswana, Namibia, the animals are owned by the government. You manage the animals on your land, but they are owned by the government. Whether you can privately own animals in South Africa.
Interesting.
And dare I say, it is the private sector that has driven this, has driven the Rewilding project in South Africa. And that is why I think organisations like United Nations, which I'll be talking about this evening at my talk, have looked at South Africa as a model they can trust and manage as part of this wider rewilding plan.
You've given us a good snapshot of the rewilding. How well did it do to revive the economy of the area?
Very good question. If you listen to Adrian, it did everything. Of course.
Of course.
There's a great quote that I use at my talks, and it's conservation without cash is a conversation. In other words, you do need to incentivize people, and that's the key. We're part of this system, and people tend to be selfish. What's in it for me? Whether it's food, whether it's income, whether it's a job, whether it's improving their environment. So along the way, we have seen international tourism, certainly, domestic tourism. But what does that bring for the local people? Well, even as far as people sitting in restaurants, hiring cars, staying in hotels, obviously the people that serve you at the table, your own guide, your ranger on these reserves should be a local person so that they can see the benefit. Again, I'll talk about tonight about Adrian's latest project, which is a very small reserve, but it's more geared up to the local community to show Africans what wildlife can do. Now, there's a flip side to this, which I also talk about in the book, because as a historian, you have to see both sides, as you know. What about the farms or the farmers that have been removed? They've been there for generations. What about the workers that rely on the farming economy? So there is a detrimental aspect to this, and not everybody's in agreement. But I'm a brave man as a professional speaker. I've given talks to farm groups in that region. Sometimes it's been quite hostile, and I listen to them, because there's always a way of working together. It's a case of finding the middle ground. Remember my initial point, this was an area of marginal food production.
Right.
So you're not damaging the food security of South Africa by changing the landscape. What you have to do is convince the locals that they will also benefit.
Is the preserve still growing?
Well, Adrian sold Shamwari, which is what he's known for.
Right.
He sold that back in 2008. As a businessman, everything has a price. He sold it to Dubai World. The Arabs came in and actually still run it very, very well. It's known as one of the best reserves, can we say, in terms of hospitality, in terms of animal preservation, in terms of management of land in Africa. And Adrian went on to use that money to create a hospitality empire, but he always felt that his legacy was going to be in rewilding and conservation. And he also realised, let's be frank, that there was money to be made as well. Now South Africa was on the map in terms of wildlife tourism.
Sure.
So Shamwari is very much there. Adrian owns a property on Shamwari called Founders Lodge, which guests still come to, but he also has started about 3 years ago, he started a place called Neosi, which is only 20 minutes outside of Port Elizabeth, and it's a peri-urban reserve, which is slightly different. And this is a great example of preserving areas of land for rewilding. They don't have to be in the wilderness. They can be close to a town or a city, which this is in particular. There's a herd of elephant. He rewilds cheetah on that land, and if that land hadn't have been saved or captured, it would have been used for other things, perhaps urbanization, building, or other detrimental things that were happening at the time, illegal hunting, those kind of things. So now it's actually serving a purpose, not only for tourists, but for local people, Africans especially, who have never seen an animal wild in their environment, which is strange, isn't it?
Yeah.
And that is what we stand for as educators. I think education is the most important thing. People need to experience wildlife. And you don't have to fly in an aircraft or travel in a jeep for 6 hours. You can have it on your doorstep and it can still be wild. But that's the low-hanging fruit we need to aim for when we need to talk about rewilding or preserving our spaces.
Fascinating. Reminds me much of the Wildlife Refuge System, which our agency manages. Nice, positive story. I'd be remiss if I didn't talk about your other book with one of the best historical titles ever, Empire, War, and Cricket. You began as a sports historian. What do empire, war, and cricket have in common?
Well, thank you for mentioning it. Well, that's probably what I'm best known for in South Africa and parts of, can we say, the English-speaking world, because, as you said, empire, war, and cricket, it really says it all. It's a story of a man, a 19-year-old Scotsman who emigrated to South Africa in the late 1800s and made his money through diamonds and knowing the right people and being very charismatic, being a man at the frontier. And it's a story that I know appeals to Americans because you have your own story of the Wild West. It was the tough that survived. Right. So he's my central figure, but he created a town which is very famous in South Africa, nowhere else. Strange sounding name called Mitjiesfontein. It already existed, but he built a perfectly preserved Victorian village. But the title comes from, he was new money, he was working class. He had to buy influence into this class system that the British Empire was based upon. So he brought the English cricket team down to South Africa. He was a benefactor. He put his money into sport. And let's face it, Mark, nobody questions you if you're involved in sport because it's such a virtuous pursuit,
right.
isn't it?
We all love sport.
It came from my PhD, and as I was writing the PhD, I knew that this was going to be a really good book, and it's become a really, really popular book in South Africa. It's been out for a decade. I do lots of talks. I never get sick of telling this story. It's a Downton Abbey. It's a Gilded Age. It's that kind of romance, but it's true. In fact, as we know, facts more wonderful than fiction sometimes. And this guy was quite an incredible man. But it brings together all the facets of what was happening with the British Empire. How those Brits took over the world in that 100-year period. They did so through their culture, their language, their so-called superior civilization, which was a load of nonsense, of course, but they did that by waving the flag, and it was all done for Queen and country. And down in South Africa, as I said, they got a foothold because of the gold and diamonds that were discovered. It led to a war, the South African War of 1899 to 1902. We've talked off air about my fascination with America's recent history, the American Civil War, and how different economic models can tear a country apart. The same was happening in South Africa, and I think that's why I have such passion with coming here.
Fascinating. Last question. Going back to the Adrian Gardiner book, is his example of rewilding exportable to other places?
Without a doubt. I don't think I would have even taken this project on if I didn't see its wider relevance, and that's why I'm here in the United States talking about it. Wherever I go, I look at your examples, and it's the idea that there has to be a business model behind this. I think we can be very idealistic, but if you don't incentivize people, in Adrian's particular case, he was the businessman. He partnered with a man called Ian Player. Some of your listeners would have heard of Gary Player, the famous golfer. Sure. Well, Ian is equally famous in South Africa because he's known as the man who saved the white rhino in the 60s and 70s. Adrian needed someone that gave him the credibility from the conservation point of view. Ian needed somebody with the money, drive, and the marketing acumen to make this happen, and that's exactly how partnerships work. So yes, with the right people, with the right drive, with the right incentives, this rewilding model can happen. And remember, as I'll talk about later, I don't think we've got a choice, have we? This planet is the only one we're living on. We've got to look after those pockets of land that are still relatively unscathed, and even those that we have affected, we can turn the clock back. We saw that during COVID. So I wouldn't have written this book if it was a very much just a South Africa or a regional story. Yes, it's based upon there, but I think we can take this model anywhere because everyone will recognize an Adrian Gardiner. Everyone will recognize what he did and what he stood for, and of course it wasn't an easy story. I mean, the man went bust. He was bankrupt twice in his business career, so he knows what it's like to struggle as well. But that kind of personality doesn't take no for an answer. And as I said, I'm proud to give this man now in his 80s a book that he can look back with and be proud of, and it's warts and all. I criticise him on various levels in terms of what he did and perhaps some of the early mistakes that he made, but I'm proud to have been able to tell a story that has a wider resonance elsewhere.
This is a perfect conclusion for a podcast called The Future of Conservation, a very positive story. We've been talking with Dr. Dean Allen. His two books are The Man Who Changed the Landscape, the Adrian Gardiner story, and Empire, War, and Cricket. He is going to be giving a talk tonight here at NCTC, which will be viewable on the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service YouTube page in a week or so. Thank you very much.
What a pleasure. Thank you for having me, Mark.